And so thank you so much for joining us today. Um, I know that stepping up to speech mapping is one of my most favourite topics that I love to talk about. And I hope that it will add some value to your verification processes that you're using in your clinic. There will be a quiz and evaluation form sent out to everyone post this as well. And during the Q&A, during the session, Michelle will be answering any of the questions that appear in the Q&A box along the way as well. I think it's important that you know that we at Sonic are really aware of the issues and the hard times that you're facing at the moment with the COVID-19 pandemic, and that we are here to help you in whatever way that we can during this period. For those of you who've been to our website before, www.soniceye.com.au, you'll see that there are a number of things there. Sonic not only distributes Sonic hearing aids, but also a very wide range of diagnostic equipment. And so I'd invite you to visit our website whenever you can to see what's available at the time. I thought it's always really great to be able to put a face to a name, and I'm sure most of you have spoken to some of us at one time or another, or sent emails, and so I thought it would be valuable for you to just have a look at who we are. So you will all know Werner Schwendener. He's our General Manager based in Brisbane. I'm based in Adelaide. We have a new audiologist on staff, Michelle Wallace, and Michelle is based in Melbourne. We have Eric Chan as our help desk support, and so I'm sure that many of you have had contact with Eric before. He's also based in Brisbane. And the other Brisbane staff, Rachel, who is our marketing coordinator, Alwyn, who deals with all of our equipment contracts, such as the Aboriginal community health equipment, the New Zealand newborn hearing screening program, and really manages all of that equipment in repairs and calibration. We have Paula, who is our office manager, and Anastasia, who is our admin assistant. And so we're all working hard at this time in our offices or home offices during this time to make sure that we can still fulfill all of our client and customer needs as well. So today's webinar is all about verification of hearing aids, and we know that right back in the old days that we did verification by 2cc coupler, and then for the last, say, 40 years we've been using real ear insertion gain, especially in Australia, and more recently many clinicians and countries around the world are changing to speech mapping. We know that with the test box measures that that's very pertinent at the moment, because we know that HSP has now allowed the use of test box measures as part of the verification process. And so I thought it was important that we cover that just briefly at the moment. So we know a test box measure, you connect a hearing aid into a test box, and then you can match the output of the hearing aid just like you would in a real ear situation with target curves that are generated from the software. So we know that that's an easy way, especially at these times where we have social distancing, to be able to really be able to at least set a first fit for the clients. There are other tests that you can do as well that are worthwhile considering. So you can measure the harmonic distortion in the hearing aid. So as hearing aids get older, a certain amount of distortion comes into the signal, and the client may not even notice that because they've been getting so used to it over time. You can measure the battery drain of a device if you're concerned that batteries are being used up too quickly. And you can also perform real ear to coupler difference measures so that you can have even a more precise target match for your hearing aids in the box. So as part of what Sonic's doing in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic, we are actually offering a really big special on our Medrex Hit box of $6,000 plus GST. And so hopefully that enables some of you to be able to at least be able to perform those couple of gain to target measures for your clients at this time. Now, if you're using a coupler, you do need to consider a few things. You need to go into the options, and I have the Medrex software up here, and I will be using the Medrex software throughout the presentation. But a lot of these concepts also apply to any other manufacturer as well. So you would go into your options, you'd go to the setup, and then when you're in the setup screen, it enables you to select some parameters. Now, there are a lot of parameters there, and for coupler boxes, the most important ones are these ones down the bottom. So we know that if you have a BTE with a thin tube versus a BTE with a standard 13 tubing, that the output of the hearing aid at the end of the tube is different. We know that high frequencies don't travel down those thin tubes as well, and so we really do need in this section to say what sort of tubing that we're using along the way. And then things such as, is it open? There's a whole lot of parameters there that are actually very, very important to consider when you're setting up your test box measure. So mostly though, and for a very long time, people have been using real ear insertion gain as their preferred verification method. And so we know that when we're doing real ear insertion gain measures, that what we're going to do is we're going to have the probe tube in the ear, we're going to have the reference microphone sitting outside the ear, and first of all we do our unaided measure, our REUG measure, where we measure the sound level in the ear canal, and we take away the sound level from the reference microphone, and that gives us our unaided gain, which is this curve down the bottom. And then we put the hearing aid in and we turn it on and we perform the same test again. So put the sound through the speaker, measure what's in the ear canal, and take away what the level is at the reference microphone, and that gives us the REAG. We take both of those measures away from each other, and that gives us the real ear insertion gain, and those gain values are plotted on the graph. More recently though, people are turning to speech mapping as their preferred verification process. It's a very simple process. Essentially what you're doing is you're putting your probe tubes in both ears at the same time. You're putting the hearing aid in, you're turning the hearing aids on, you're not turning off any features, not doing anything different. You're running the ISTS stimulus. Again, just changing and modifying the gain handles to reach target and pressing stop, and then obtaining the output curves that you see on the right. So a very simple process. Although I've found that many clinicians find the transition from real ear insertion gain into speech mapping a little bit scary because they're not as confident in it. But what I do know is that once people do start using speech mapping, that they never go back to insertion gain. So as we step through this, I really want to make sure that we look at all of the factors that will impact on the outcome of the test. And one of the first things is the probe tube placement. Now, we know that when you put a hearing aid or an ear mold or a receiver into the ear canal and sound starts to come out of that receiver, that there'll be some null points set up, some dead zones, and the frequency gets higher and higher the further out that you go. And those near field effects are important to consider, especially if you're using REIG. And so the recommendation is that you always put the end of your probe tube at least 5 millimeters past the outlet of the sound, and that way you know that the probe tube end is not in one of those dead areas. Now, when we measure speech mapping, we're going to measure what is at the eardrum level. And so now we also need to consider the fact that sound is travelling down the ear canal towards the eardrum, and then some of the sound is bouncing back off the eardrum back into the ear canal. And so that means that there will again be some interference and some null points set up. We know that if you place the probe tube, the end of that probe tube within 6 millimeters of the eardrum, that you'll at least be within 2 dB of the 6K level and 4 dB of the 8K level. So the depth of insertion of the probe tube is a critical thing when it comes to doing speech mapping, especially where you really want to measure what is at the eardrum. It'll be a combination of resonant peaks and gain. It'll be a combination of many things, but what's of interest here is what actually hits the eardrum. Now, how do we get at 6 millimeters from the eardrum? So if you had a video otoscope, then you would, of course, you could place the probe tube in there, have a little look, and make sure that it's positioned quite deeply. But in general, we use the rule that we know that the average adult ear canal is 24 millimeters deep, and that the distance from the end of the ear canal to the tragus is about 10 millimeters, so 34 millimeters altogether. So if we put that probe tube end and we mark on the probe tube 28 to 30 millimeters, and we place that mark at the tragus, then we know that we're pretty close to being 6 millimeters away from the eardrum. If you're not deep enough, then what's going to happen is when you start to run your test, that you'll see that there's not enough gain in the high frequencies, around 3 or 4K, that you'll be pushing up the gain handles and nothing's happening. So my recommendation is always, when you start your test, if your high frequencies are not quite up high enough, the first thing you should do is move that probe tube in another couple of millimeters. And you know what? Many times that just moves the end of that probe tube out of the dead zone for that frequency, and all of a sudden those high frequency levels pop up again. So that's a very important thing to consider when you're doing speech mapping. It's also important, just with like any other real ear measure, that you calibrate your probe tube. And probe tube calibration is very important. We know that each probe tube has its own acoustics, its own special variation outside of the norm, the standard deviation. And so when we calibrate our probe tube, what we're doing is we're going to see what those slight variations are, and we're going to make the probe tube acoustically invisible to the measurement. So if you're using your Medrex software and you're calibrating your probe tube, then just make sure that you, when you're running the stimulus, that the reference level here is about 74 to 75 dB. Now what that does is it tells us that the speaker is turned up loud enough to be able then to perform the test that you want to do. Client position is another important thing to consider. And so these are all things that we need to consider before we've even started the test. So distance is important. If you're too close to the speaker, then if the head is turned slightly to one side, there will be a shadowing of the ear at the back. If you're too far away from the speaker, then the ambient noise and the other reflections coming from the surfaces around you will also interfere with the test. So, the distance is important. And my general rule is that I just ensure that the client's hand can rest on top of the speaker. And in general, that's about 0.5 to 0.7 meters away. So just an ideal distance to be away. Now, We do need to consider reflective surfaces. So ideally, they're around a 1 metre radius circle. There shouldn't be any hard surfaces. So make sure that you're not too close to your booth walls and things like that. Really try to get that client into a fairly free area and a free zone so you don't have any interference. Something that a lot of people aren't aware of is that, because every room is a slightly different shape and slightly different furniture and reflective surfaces, and every speaker has slightly different characteristics, that again, if we calibrate our speaker in the position where it normally sits, we can then look again at all of those little variations, ironing out those variations so that there's, again, less error in our measurement. Now, it only takes a couple of minutes to perform, and when should you do it? Well, you're not going to do it before every test. If you're in a clinic room and you're not moving things around, then when you've calibrated it once, then you don't need to calibrate it again. If you get a new speaker, then you should calibrate it again. If you're going off to a visiting site, so you're setting up all of the equipment in a different setup, then you should run it at the beginning of the day. And then if you move it back into clinic again the next day, then run it again. It really only takes a couple of minutes to perform, and it's well worthwhile the exercise, because what we want to do is we want to iron out all of these problem areas before we even start, so that our test result is the best that we can get. So speech mapping, live speech mapping. Now you would have heard that term a lot. So what exactly is live speech mapping? We know that live speech mapping is when you use a live voice. And if you were to perform live speech mapping on this screen, we can see that the threshold, that's the bottom red line, that threshold now is inverted and converted to SPL for the client. On the top, you have the UCL as well. And so now we can see the dynamic range of this person in relation to their UCL and their threshold. And then the goal is with soft speech, so probably around 50 dB, is to ensure that that soft speech is just above threshold, that normal level speech, so about 65 dB level speech, falls about a third of the way up from the dynamic range. And you can see that white area there. That white area is the modified speech spectrum, and it's the speech spectrum but squashed down and compressed to meet that person's reduced dynamic range. And then of course you have loud speech, which is about 80 dB, and you want to make sure that that loud speech doesn't actually touch or go over the person's UCL. Now, we know in Australia under HSP that live speech mapping is not allowed, and so what we do is we use a recorded signal, and that recorded signal is the International Speech Test Signal. Now, the International Speech Test Signal, in the old days, they used to have a lot of speech signals. So there was the carrot patch and the rainbow passage, and all of them had different spectrums. And so when people did research, they were not really comparing apples to apples. And so all of the manufacturers and a number of researchers, and Harvey Dillon was included in this, they all got together and worked on producing this International Speech Test Signal, the ISTS. And the beauty of that is that it's reproducible for everyone, that it has all of the features of normal speech, and then it uses an international language, not just one language. So when they developed the ISTS, what they did is they had 21 female speakers with 6 different languages. They said a selected sentence and they recorded them and they filtered them so that everything was just as averaged out for normal speech as possible. And then they cut up all the pieces and mix them all together. And so we know that when clients are listening to the ISTS, they always sort of go, oh, what language is that? And because when you listen to it, you'll hear yourself, there'll be a little bit of German or a little bit of French or a little bit of English that you'll actually recognize as you go along. Now, when they put all of the pieces together, they then had to check to make sure that this new speech signal actually represented true speech and didn't have huge variations. And one of the things they looked at was the percentile distribution. Now, for those who are not used to looking at percentile analysis, you can see that in the middle of the coloured blocks, there is an LTAS curve. Now, the LTAS curve, that's the average curve, that's what you see when you're doing your real ear measurements. You only see the average line. But we know that speech has dynamics, about 20 to 30 dB in dynamic range. And so even though, say, at 1K you'll have the output line at a particular level, we know that there will be parts of speech that will be louder than that, and they're the orange and red bits, and then parts of speech at that frequency that will be softer. There will be a range, and this is a visual representation of the variation at each frequency over time of a 65 dB input speech. So it can be very useful, and I am going to come and talk about that a little bit later in the presentation as well. So when you're using the ISTS, it's important that you know a bit more about it. We know that the first 15 seconds are required to enable all of the algorithms and the features to engage. So you need to run it at least for 15 seconds to start off with. And then there's 45 seconds more for measurement, and that every time you make a change, you need to wait for at least 10 seconds after that change in gain to actually be able to see it. So you do need to run that signal for quite a while. You can't just turn it on, get a quick curve and come out again. Otherwise, you haven't really recorded the true LTAS or the average. Now, in your metrics, of course, what you'll find is that that 60 seconds is looped. And so the signal will continue, so that enables you to fine-tune your hearing aid as you go along. Now, the screen, it's a little bit different than what you'd be used to if you were using real ear insertion gain. But here's a little hint, and this is the way I always love to teach people, is when you first open up your Medrex software, you'll see that up in the corner is a little NOA button. Now, if you press that NOA button, it takes you into the overlay mode. And so in the overlay mode, you can have your fitting software open on the bottom. You can have it on the page where you have all of your gain handles. And then you have your REM sitting on top of that. And so that you don't need to flip-flop from one screen to another, that you can see what's happening with your output curves. You can make modifications on your gain handles down the bottom. And so everything is seamless on one screen. And so in speech mapping, you just, because you have this continuous signal going on, then you can just move the gain handles down the bottom. You know now that your output curve is about where you want it to be, and you press stop. So it's a very simple way of being able to achieve your target. Now, if you're doing insertion gain, then of course you're very used to these lines. So you've got the 50, 65 and 80. And we know that with compression, with wide dynamic range compression, that as you increase the input level, you decrease the gain. And so when you put a 50 dB stimulus in, you'll get a certain amount of gain. And then when you turn up the stimulus, you get less gain. And then when you turn it up yet again to 80, then you'll get less gain again. So we can see that this is what the insertion gain screen looks like. And now when we come to the speech mapping screen, it's slightly different. We can see that we again have an 80, a 65 and a 50 curve, but now, because this is an REAR view, what we're doing is the 50 curve represents 50 dB of stimulus plus the gain, and the 65 curve represents 65 stimulus plus the gain, and the 80 curve is 80 dB stimulus plus the gain. And so you can see that the 80 curve's on the top, the 65's in the middle, and then the 50 is underneath. So it is the opposite to the view of insertion gain. And then, most importantly, you can see that threshold actually appears on the graph as well. So again, converted to SPL and inverted, but now it gives us a real view, a feel of the amplification levels that we're providing and how much of that amplification sits above threshold, and just it enables us to troubleshoot and fine-tune a lot better. Now, remember we did talk about percentile analysis. So here we have the ISTS signal. We've measured it in the ear canal. We have our LTAS line in the middle, the dark line, and we can see the variation from loud to soft across each of those frequencies. Now, if we were to then put the hearing aid in and now measure what's happening to that input signal once it's gone through the hearing aid, then we can see a different picture. So here, especially in the high frequencies, you can see that the input signal, the dynamic range, is much bigger. And then when we look at the aided level, we can see that those high frequency signals are much more compressed because the area of that curve is much, much smaller. So we know that when we put a 65 dB speech signal in, that the loudest parts of that signal are going to be affected by the 80 curve and the compression above, and then the softer parts of the signal are going to be more affected by the 50 curve from below. And so the impact of both of those is going to squash that speech signal closer to closer. And so this is a visual representation of compression. So some people, when they're in their speech mapping screen, here you can see that in the middle I've changed it to just the threshold and the 65 dB target line. That you can also view the speechogram as well. So the speechogram represents the predicted compressed signal based on that fitting and based on the software. And so it can give you a visual idea, but unless you did measure percentile analysis, then you wouldn't be able to see exactly what your signal's doing. The percentile analysis is actually in your software, but it just needs to be enabled. Now, here's just a visual of the difference between the compression of NL1 and NL2 for the same hearing loss. So this is the same hearing loss, but you can see that the speechogram of the NL1 is quite broad, so that's a more linear amplification. And then when you look at the NL2 speechogram, you can see how much smaller that is. So there's a lot more compression happening to the output signal at 65 in this version. Now, when you go into options again, so in your options screen, you go into setup, again, there are a number of parameters. And people get very confused, I think, because not all of these things are going to affect the real ear target. We know that gender does, because we know that males like to have their sound 2 to 3 dB louder than females, so that will affect the target. We know that language will, so the difference between tonal and non-tonal. We know that if you set the levels at new user rather than experienced, that will change the target levels. We know that if you use the air-bone correction factor, that will also affect the target. So it will add a half to a third of the air-bone gap onto the gain, onto the target as well. And we know that the binaural will also. Um, one of the advantages of having two ears, of course, is that if you're fitted binaurally, you actually need less sound level, so about 3 dB less sound, because the sound from both ears summates together and produces a louder version. So if you do have a monaural fitting, it would be wise to go in and change that option. But the other options don't have any impact. So, you know, people often say to me, oh, but I've selected open. Well, the target is the target is the target. And the acoustics are not taken into account in a real ear measurement. So whether you select open or closed, the real ear target always remains the same. So if you're going in and making lots of corrections, most probably you could save yourself a little bit of time by only thinking about the ones that are really going to make a little bit of difference to those target curves. Now, can I see if compression's working? So we know that in insertion gain, that we know that if this was linear, so every time I put an input in, I got the same gain applied to it, then all of these three curves would overlay on top of each other. But because these curves are different, we know that as we put different input in, that we get different amounts of gain applied. And so it's very easy to see. Can we see that when we do speech mapping? So in speech mapping, we know that the difference between each of those curves, the 50 to 65 and the 65 to 80, is a 15 dB input. And so whenever the lines get closer, we know that there is compression happening. So if all of the all of those lines were equally 15 dB apart from each other across all the frequencies, then we'd be saying that there's no compression working in that device, that it's more linear. What about sloping losses? Now, this is a reasonably normal audiogram. You can see that the hearing drops off in the high frequencies. And now when we look at this curve and with all of the targets on it, and now that we can see threshold, so the red dots, we can see that the targets actually fall a bit below in the higher frequencies. Now, why is that? Is there a problem in the software? Are these targets wrong? So let me go back again to percentile analysis. Remember, we talked about the fact that an LTAS line is only an average line, and there is sound above and there is sound below. And here, I've just put the 65 curve on for convenience, and then I've changed the view into the view with the speechogram. And so now we can see that, there can be about 12 to 15 dB of sound louder than the LTAS curve, the louder the parts of speech. And so when we look at this now, we can see that there is a lot of audible sound in those high frequencies, but only for the louder parts of that. And you wouldn't see that. These are exactly the same targets, the same algorithm as what you would see in insertion gain, but because insertion gain doesn't show you threshold, you never get a real feel of what's going on. And so the minute that we start looking at what the speechogram is, and we're looking at threshold as well, we now begin to sort of have a greater understanding of the output of the hearing aid and what we're doing. So why would these targets fall below? And, those targets will fall below for DSL or NL2. And it isn't that the targets are wrong. It's that the targets, the algorithms take a number of factors into consideration when they're trying to decide what what and how much they should turn sound up. So we know that the audibility for speech is much better at 2K than 4,000 hertz. So we've got most of our speech information coming in at 2,000 hertz. So we need to try and preserve that level of amplification if we can at 2,000 hertz. Now, if we turned up the gain more at 4,000 hertz as well, so we want to get it above, well above that threshold level, what might happen? What might the client actually be thinking? So, yes, you might have turned the gain up more, not realizing the fact that that cochlear damage that's happened in that area may actually mean that the whole perception of loudness of the signal of the speech at that time is going to be too loud, and the client then may want to turn the whole of the curve down. So in fact, it can have quite a negative impact on loudness. And we know from cochlear dead regions and all of the other things that if we do turn up amplification in those high areas where there may be some cochlear dead regions, that the audibility and actually the discrimination actually is negative rather than positive. So the algorithms do actually think about that balance of loudness, that balance of perception, and they don't always over amplify or amplify some of those high frequencies above that threshold level because it is all about intelligibility and being able to wear the hearing aid. Now, open fittings, they're everywhere at the moment. And so a couple of things that we just need to realize is that, so on your probe microphone here, we have the probe tube microphone at the top with the probe tube that's sitting on, and that measures what's in the ear canal. And then we have the reference microphone below that. And the job of the reference microphone is very much about monitoring the sound level reaching the ear from the speaker. Its job is like the volume control. It's always going, oh, I need it a little bit louder, a little bit softer. You know, it needs to keep it around whatever dial setting that you've set. So if you've set it at 65, it's working really hard to ensure the output from that speaker is 65. Now, open fit is really popular these days. We know that open fit hearing aids markedly reduce the feelings of occlusion, that it really allows those low to mid frequency sounds to escape out of that ear canal, and it allows that normal, natural ambient noise to come in. But when we're considering now what we're going to do when we're measuring for real ear measurement, we know that sound, the whole object of the open fit is for sound to leak out of the ear. And the moment that sound leaks out of the ear, especially amplified sound, it's going to go down to the reference microphone. And the reference microphone, it may be sitting there going, oh, I'm measuring 65. Oh, now I'm measuring 70. And what does the reference microphone do? It turns down the volume of the speaker. It doesn't realize that some of that sound is actually sound that's come out of the ear canal. So there are a number of things that we can do to actually counteract that. Now, most newer REM equipment have an open fit measurement feature. And you can see, I've just highlighted it down there in the turquoise circle. So in an open fit feature, the first stage is you have the hearing aid in and turned off. You press start and it runs a calibration tone. So during that time, it's setting the level of the speaker to be perhaps 65 if that's what you want, and it's setting it and it stops. So now in the second stage, you turn the hearing aid on and the reference microphone automatically turns off. And so now as the signal's coming and the amplified sound is leaking out of the ear, it no longer is actually going to interact with the reference microphone because you've already set it at a pre-set calibration level. And that works well as long as the client doesn't move. So if the client decides to jiggle around or sit back, then you will need to start that process again. Now, if you're using a Medrex, so on the ISTS signal, when you press start, what you will have noticed is that there's a calibration tone. It doesn't last for very long, and then when it stops, that's when the ISTS signal starts. In fact, there's an automatic open fit feature here. So the minute that that calibration is set, it turns off the reference microphone and uses that pre-stored calibration value. So you've already got an automatic open fit happening when you're using that IST signal. That's pretty cool. Now, you might unfortunately have older equipment that doesn't have an open fit feature in it. So at least you should be pulling the reference microphone further away from the opening of the ear canal, so there's less chance of any sound that's leaking out getting back into that reference microphone. Now, something else for you to consider as well. So high gain hearing aids. We know we've just released the Trek, the Sonic Trek hearing aids, our superpower and ultra power hearing aids. And, you know, they're fitting up to 120 dB loss. So these are hearing aids that are really pumping out a whole lot of gain. Now, we do know that some of the sound from high gain hearing aids will actually start to leak out from around the ear mold and from the tubing itself. So for those really super ultra power hearing aids, you can also consider using an open fit feature so that you pre-calibrate your reference microphone, and then any amplified sound that's coming out or leaking out has no effect. So it's something for you to consider when you're doing those high gain hearing aids. CROS and BICROS. Now, I get this question quite a lot. So what special thing do I need to do? Now, the important thing when you're doing CROS or BICROS is that you need to be able to decide which side of the head the reference microphone is going to be enabled on. So in this case, where the poorer ear is the right ear, all I need to do is enable and click on the right ear in the software, and that tells me that the right ear now is the reference microphone that's being used in this measurement. So that's a handy little trick for you to know when you're doing your CROS and BICROS measurements. Now, what about troubleshooting? That's always a very important thing. So I want to just talk briefly about the shape and the balance of your output curve. So I know that we're allowed to have plus or minus 5 dB variance around the target line. But we're also dealing with people with hearing loss and many people who are suffering from recruitment of different degrees. And so having something 2 dB above the target line and then another frequency being 2 dB below the target line, 2 dB may not sound like much to you and I with normal hearing, but for people with recruitment, the balance between each of the frequencies is important. So either having all of the lines slightly above the target or slightly below the target is a much better option in terms of balancing each frequency to optimize the speech intelligibility. So just something to think about when you're looking at the shape of your curve. Yes, I've ticked the box of plus or minus 5, but really, am I making some sounds perceptively a lot louder to clients than other sounds? And I'm really mixing with the balance of each of the frequencies needed to really optimise the speech discrimination for the client. Now, another thing to consider is the resonant peak. So we know that the resonant peak, it's been around for a long time, and we're able to measure it because the ear is open at one end. And because the ear canal is open, it has a resonant frequency, and that resonant frequency is around 2.7 kilohertz. And we know that if we have an open fitting, that the resonant peak stays there, it's retained. And so when you put open in your fitting software, the fitting software takes into account that you're going to retain that resonant peak. Now, if you have a closed fitting and you put that into the software, then your fitting software goes, closed fitting, that's going to actually reduce or remove the resonant peak. So I'm going to have to build that in on top of everything else that I do. And so setting the right acoustics in your fitting software is critical as well. So how open is an open fitting? Well, the way to really measure how open your open fitting is, because remember, you're going to have a tube, a receiver, a dome, a mold with a vent in it. All of those things, the fact that they're physically in the ear are going to have an impact on that resonant peak. And so by using a real ear occluded response measure, we can measure what's happening in the ear. It's like a real ear unaided test, except that you have all the bits of the hearing aid in the ear, and then you're just looking for what's happening to that resonant peak at the end. So, and that can be very useful, especially when we come to think about fitting these hearing losses that are more low to sort of mild, low to mild hearing losses, especially in the mids and the low frequencies. So this audiogram, it's not a terrible audiogram, like it's sloping down from about 20 down to 40. You know, that's a pretty not unusual audiogram. If we did the real ear unaided gain, so we looked for the resonant peak, we might find that peak. But now, if we look at the gain required for that hearing loss, and we look at the resonant peak, what do we see? We see that the resonant peak is actually now above where the target gain is. And so there's no way, there's nothing that you can do. You're going to be trying to pull down the gain at say 2K, you're pulling it down, nothing's happening, or you're getting this big bump around 1500 hertz. And for whatever you do, you just cannot get rid of that bump. So my suggestion is, if you've got those bumps there and you want to really make sure what's causing it, is that gain from the hearing aid? What's actually happening is that you would run an REOR, and that's really easy. Or whether it's insertion gain or speech mapping, just leave the hearing aid in the ear, turn it off, and run the curve again. And then you'll be able to see the residual level of the resonant peak and how large it is. And so that can be quite an important thing when you look at what you're trying to do and modify in your fitting to meet your target level. And you know, sometimes we see fittings where only low gain is required, and in fact all of the response is actually the resonant peak. And so you need to question the worthwhileness of actually fitting that hearing loss. There are additional things you can do. So not only just measure, put 65 in and measure what's coming out, there are other things that you can measure with your speech mapping. And so one of them is you can identify feedback. So if you fine tune the sampling down to a very small number of frequencies wide, then you can actually measure the exact frequency of the feedback. And that might be really useful for you if you're thinking about if you're needing to change your acoustics or something like that. for persistent feedback. Is your aid really feeding back or not? You can measure noise reduction. Now, every manufacturer does noise reduction differently. They apply different amounts of gain reduction based on the identification of noise. And so this is a very easy test to do. I mean, you do one run with the noise reduction turned on and one run with the noise reduction turned off. And the difference just lets you know what's happening with the noise reduction at that time. And so say if you've run it for one model, for one manufacturer, at least now you have an idea when they say medium, what's actually happening in the hearing aid in terms of its ability to reduce noise. Is the directionality working, or how good is the directionality in the device I've fitted? Very simple to test. So you do a run from the front and then you turn the client around, being careful not to strangle them with all the wires and everything along the way, and do another run. And then you can see what the actual effect of the directivity is having for this particular fitting with this particular client. Really simple things to do that we don't think about. We often don't use our REM machines to their full capability. Now, occlusion, you can even measure the amount of occlusion that's occurring in a client's ear. So is it really occlusion that I'm dealing with? I just can't seem to figure out what's happening. So I put the probe tube in the client's ear. I get them to say a loud, low frequency sound like E, and I measure that just with the probe tube in the ear. And so what it's going to pick up is, we know that that E sound is going to be vibrating the skull. It's going to be sending low mid-frequency sound into the ear canal. And we can actually measure what it's like when there's no blockage at the end of the ear canal. So normally that's not a problem for us because it's open and the sound goes out. And then you would put the hearing aid into the ear, turned off, and then you would repeat it again. And so the yellow line was the baseline without the hearing aid turned in, and then the purple line shows now what happens just when you put the ear mold into the ear. And so wherever there's a difference of 20 or more, we can say that there is significant occlusion happening in that ear. So performing speech mapping, it's really simple. I know it can be a little bit, people are nervous about it, but you put the probe tubes in the ear, you turn the hearing aids on and put them in the ear, you run the ISTS, you adjust the gain handles, you have your curves, you meet target exactly the same, and you stop. So why use speech mapping? So today's hearing aids are incredibly complex. They have a lot of adaptive features and analysis algorithms. We know that verifying with a speech signal is much more relevant. We're looking at how the features are interacting, how the compressors are working, how the hearing aid is actually performing in the client's ear to speech. And that's, let's face it, that's what they want to listen to. It's really fast, and because it's fast, because it then allows you to spend much more time counselling your client about how to look after the hearing aid, how to turn it on, how to put a battery in, fine-tuning it, making sure that they're able to wear the hearing aid. That's the real bonus, is you're still measuring target, you're finding out exactly, you're getting a first fit, and you're doing it in a very quick time, and you're doing it to speech, which is an incredibly relevant input signal. So I just want to remind you here at the end that Sonic does look after a lot of Sonic hearing aids, and also you can see by the all of the images down the bottom of the diagnostic equipment that Sonic really is a one-stop shop for everything. So please come to the website, have a look, make sure that if you have any queries or whatever, that you contact us up in our Brisbane office or email us. We're always happy to be able to spend time with you, to be able to work out the best solutions for what you need. Now, I want you all to remember that you will need to have the quiz and the evaluation filled out to get your endorsed points, and that today or tomorrow you'll receive that email with the links in it. We really appreciate you being able to attend today. It's fantastic. This is the first of many of our webinars that we're going to do. And we're really looking for things that are going to change your everyday clinical practice and really assist you to get the best outcomes for your clients. So thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your time. I hope it's been of value, and I look forward to hearing from you all soon. Thank you.